All right, so hey everyone, I'd like to welcome you to our training today on the cost principles and how to develop your budget for your application. My name is Suhaila Lasky, and I am a senior financial grants analyst and co-team lead with the Office on Violence Against Women in our grants financial management division. So I've been doing this for about the past 15 years, 14 of which has been with OVW, and I want to introduce my other co-team lead, Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. Michael Sterling, co-team lead as well of the Grants Financial Management Division team.
Yeah, so today we're going to go ahead and go over some content through the slides, but I want to also encourage you, if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the Q&A chat or the Q&A box. Michael's on the line and he's going to respond to your questions in real time. And at the very end, we'll also open it up for any other questions if you want to pop on. You can verbalize your question if you want to do it at that point, but you don't have to wait till the end. So he's here, keep him busy, throw in any questions you might have. So our goal with this presentation today is to really help you as an applicant to create your budget, provide an understanding of the things you should be thinking of when determining what costs to include in your budget and where to put them. We want to help reduce any challenges you may face with the budget, make it clear what we look for when we review your budget. So I will also provide insight as to what OVW financial analysts, what we consider during our review. One thing that will be helpful for this training, Michael, if you can include a link to the sample budget worksheet from our website. So Michael will put that in the chat box for everybody to see. So I think it'll be helpful if you have out that sample budget detail worksheet as we go through all of the categories. And it'll help make everything make sense as we go through. So we're going to go through from like the beginning to the end of a budget and walk through all of the different categories. Okay, I think that'll just really help maximize the training for you today. All right, so just like with any other training, we got to start off with the basics, right? So that starts off with understanding how to treat the costs that you can include in the budget. So the uniform guidance, they have this whole section called cost principles, and they set the federal government's expectations for a recipient's standards for administering these federal dollars. So what types of standards do we have for you and your costs, and why is this all important? So when you are creating your budget, each and every cost or line item in the budget, it should be allowable, reasonable, and necessary to the project. So for this discussion, we will use the purchase of a laptop for an advocate as an example. And we're going to go through each of these bullet points that you see here and how they're relevant. So first is the allowability. So it's whether a cost is allowable with all federal and state regulations. And with the program solicitation, you know, that big document that you guys are reviewing right now as part of your application process that lays out the entire program scope and everything. So, you know, the costs have to be allowable within that program solicitation as well. They should be with your consistent with your internal policies and any other legal authority that you would need to follow. So for the example with the advocate's laptop, the cost may be allowable in the uniform guidance, but it may not be based on what the program solicitation says. So it's important that when you're reading through that program solicitation, that you're taking a keen look at what things are and are not allowable and within the scope of the project too. So make sure that you're considering all these different regulations and policies for the allowability of cost, because that's what we're taking into consideration as well on our end. All right, so next on the list is whether or not the cost is reasonable. So we perform what is called a prudent person test. And that's where we ask ourselves, would a prudent person say, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable cost for this item? So for our advocate's laptop in this example, is the cost super high at like $5,000, or is it a reasonable cost at around $1,200 and perfect for the staff position, that staff person, for them to perform their daily duties? Okay. So is the cost reasonable? And the last is the cost necessary. So based on your project that you're proposing and the activities that that advocate is going to perform, is the laptop necessary for them to perform their work under this project? This is why the narrative section of every single category is so important, because that is your chance to justify and support the need for that cost. In addition, if the advocate in our example is not projected to spend all of their time on this project, then you'll need to prorate the cost and allocate it by their percentage of time that they spend on the project. So for example, if in personnel, the advocate is listed at 50% of their time on the grant, then only 50% of the cost of the laptop should be included in this grant, okay? And last, you want to make sure that all costs are treated consistently, and that's whether or not it's being funded by federal dollars or non-federal dollars. Okay, so it should be consistent with your organization's policies and procedures. So for example, you should have one travel policy that it covers staff travel, and it doesn't vary depending on whether or not that is for federal activities or non-federally funded activities. Okay, it should just be the same travel policy across the board. We get a lot of questions about that. So, we just want to make sure that it's understood. Like when you're preparing your budget, you say, oh, well, we have this policy for our fringe benefits for our staff. Is this allowable under the OBW grant program? And the answer is, if it's something that you normally do and normally provide for your staff as part of your fringe benefit policy, then you can also include it as under your OBW award as well, or OBW application as well. Okay, so again, these are the things that you should be considering when creating your budget, because they are the exact things that we think about when we review your budget. So every single line item we look at, is the cost allowable, reasonable, and necessary? Okay, so those are like the biggest things that we have to think about for every one of them. Okay, so now that we went over the standards for determining costs, we're going to move on to classifying your costs, and we're going to go through each of the cost categories in the budget. So it's very important that your budget follows the same cost categories that we're going to line out for you throughout this presentation. But we also have it in that link that Michael included for the sample budget worksheet. It is so important that the budget that you include in your application, that it follows the same format as far as the order of the categories and the category titles. Those are the federal cost categories that we use. So it will really help facilitate a quick review of your budget if you are consistent with that. Okay. So the first thing when you're looking at your budget is whether or not a cost is a direct or an indirect cost. Okay, so what does that mean? So first off, we have the direct costs, and those are all of the costs that are related specifically to your project's activities, and you can easily identify them as such with a high degree of accuracy, that they're directly related to your project. So this would include your staff, their time for the staff who will work directly on the grant and the project activities, and their percentage of time on that project, any of their related fringe benefits, their travel costs for the project, any program supplies, any of your partners' costs, and anything else really that's directly related to the project. Okay, now on the other hand, we have indirect costs, and these are much harder to assign to a specific project or activity, and they benefit common purposes. So they can benefit more than one activity for your organization, or they benefit your organization as a whole. Like those are the costs that help your organization maintain operations and run. So examples of these would include the time spent for your human resource or finance staff and their activities. So like staff who cannot directly identify and track their time to one specific funding source or activity, because really it benefits the entire operation of that organization. Okay, so those are indirect costs. When we go through all of these cost categories, we're first going to start off with the direct cost categories. As you can see here, here's a quick summary of all of the cost categories that we're going to talk about today. And as you can see, our first section that we have is personnel through other costs. And those are all where you have the direct costs, the ones that we talked about that are directly related to your project, okay? And then at the very end, we'll talk about some indirect costs again and give some more examples of what that'll look like and how to charge those expenses or in the budget, how to charge them in the budget. Okay, so first we're going to talk about personnel on the list, and that's the first cost category. So this includes the compensation that you pay to staff for working directly on the project. This is for your recipient staff only. So not your partners, not your contractors, not your consultants, just your organization's direct staff. You want to make sure that you have a full breakdown of costs listed for each position and their projected time for activities that's related directly to the project. The breakdown should include the salary or hourly base, the percentage of time or total hours, and the total years and months. So it should be equal to the length of the project period that's stated in the program solicitation. So if the program solicitation says this is a 36-month project, then you're going to want to make sure that your budget accounts for 36 months of activity. No more, no less. All right. As you can see below the breakdowns, you want to also have a narrative for every single position that's listed in this category. It should include a description of the activities that each position will perform for the award. A lot of times I see that, you know, that there's some superfluous information that's included here. So it might be, you know, almost like a person's resume, right? I think that there's a whole different other section of your application where you can submit people's resumes. So you don't have to worry about giving me their life history, right? What I'm looking for here in the narrative in a section is really for you to tell me under this project, what exactly will they do, okay? So in the example at the bottom of this slide, which we pulled from the sample budget, you can see the cost for the program coordinator. They're listed in the personnel category. And as you can see, the base salary is $65,000 per year. And the applicant projects that they'll spend 50% of their time on the award for a total of 3 years. Below that, you'll see the narrative that clearly describes the direct activities that they'll perform. And last, make sure that your activities that you're budgeting for, again, is equal to the total months outlined in the program solicitation. So just I really want to make sure that that is heavily emphasized because I feel like this year we saw a lot of budgets that came through that were a bit less or a bit more. And so we just want to make sure that they are on point exactly. If it's a 36-month project, then submit a budget for 36 months. All right, so to close out this category, 3 of the most common mistakes that we see in personnel, they're that applicants do not include a full breakdown of the cost. They do not include a narrative for all of the positions, like they might skip a couple, but we need a narrative for everybody. And they do not budget for the staff time that covers the full award period that they're applying for. So make sure that everything's included and don't forget to triple check those calculations. Okay, so continuing through the cost categories, next we have fringe benefits. And these costs should correspond directly to the staff costs from the personnel category. There's sometimes confusion as to what can be budgeted here for fringe benefits, and we talked about this in the beginning. Like, can you only charge for the bare minimum types of fringe costs like FICA and unemployment? So just to clarify again, the basic principles for fringe benefits is that the amount that you budget should be related to each staff person's percentage of time on the grant and that the benefits are consistently applied. And that's regardless of the funding source. So federal funding, non-federal funding, whatever. One policy that covers everybody equally. Or that it covers everybody and it doesn't vary based off of whether or not it's federal or non-federal funded. Okay, so you'd include the same benefits under this award as you would for non-federal funded work. And the portion of fringe that you charge should be equal to that staff's percentage of time in the personnel category. So an example for that, you can see how that applies at the bottom of the slide under health insurance. The program coordinator, if we remember from personnel, they're only on this project for 50% of their time. So in fringe, their 50% of their health benefits are charged to this grant, okay, or to this application. The other fringe costs in this example, they're all set percentages. So that's why the base of these are the total for that staff person's personnel for the 3 years. Last on this topic, some other questions we get are about cost of living increases and merit increases and whether or not they're allowable. So those should be based on an organizational policy and applicable across the organization. So not just for positions funded with federal grant dollars. So if it's something you normally provide for all staff in accordance with your internal policies, then include that in the budget as well, okay? But it should just be documented in your internal policies. Okay, travel. This category is for travel costs incurred by the applicant's direct staff. So if you want to budget any travel costs for your consultants, your subrecipients or partners, those go in either the procurement contracts or the subaward category. And any other travel for your clients or survivors or attendees, those should be allocated in the other category, but they're not going to be allocated in travel. This is just for your direct staff. So all travel costs should be broken down, include a narrative to support every line item, follow your organization's documented travel policy. Some organizations use the GSA federal travel regulations if they don't have their own, and that's fine too. Just remember that all travel costs should be consistent treated consistently across the board, and it shouldn't be one travel policy for federal funded activities versus another one for non-federally funded activities, okay? So we're looking for consistency with your policy here. We have some examples of costs that can be included in this category and how they should be broken down. So first listed here is the required travel allocation that I'm pretty sure like just about every single program that we have, you'll find that they have a requirement for applicants to include in their budget OVW sponsored technical assistance and training travel costs. And it'll specify a dollar amount that you need to include in there. All right. But what you need to do is make sure that in the budget that you're labeling it very easy for us to identify that, oh, yes, this is they are putting this dollar amount in the budget to account for this requirement. And I can easily identify that they are meeting this requirement of the solicitation. So, you know, I can review this quite quickly and easily, right? So you just make sure that you clearly identify it as such and that you're also hitting that dollar threshold. And if you are hitting that requirement with travel from both your staff and your subrecipients and partners staff as well, just as long as it's all labeled the same in each of the different categories, we'll be able to go through and count everything up. So you'll see it when we get to the subrecipient section later on, but it'll say OVW mandated training and technical assistance there with a dollar amount, and then we can identify, oh, okay, they have hit the threshold just with different staff. So the other example that you see here is for local program mileage. And this is a cost that might be included if, let's say, your program staff, that they are going to travel locally for project purposes between the shelter and main office or your partner organizations, and they use their own vehicle. So that's, by the way, exactly what you would describe in the narrative, that this is the reason why we are, these are the activities that we're doing, and this is the reason why it's needed. But what you can also see is that the computation, so it's 150 miles per month, reimbursement rate of 65.5 cents per mile for the life of the project. So just make sure you're showing the computation, and then in the narrative, describe the purpose of that cost as well. So the most common mistakes that we find in travel category are that there's a lack of breakdown of costs, that it's missing narrative descriptions for all the line items, calculation errors, and that the costs included in this category are not actually for direct recipients or direct applicant staff, okay? All right, we're gonna move on to equipment. So this category you're going to use for non-expendable tangible property with a useful life of more than a year. So unless your organization's capitalization threshold is lower than the federal threshold, equipment items should have a fair market value of $5,000 or more, okay? But check your internal policies if you're not sure what your organization's capitalization threshold is, because as I mentioned, it might be lower, like in the example that we have here in the budget. So if you need to budget for equipment items that are rented or leased, this is like a side note, you want to include those, you want to budget those in the procurement contracts category. This section here is strictly like if you're purchasing equipment items, okay? So if you're leasing it, you're engaging in a contract for it, so you put it in the procurements category. But if you're purchasing it and it meets the threshold, then you can include it in equipment. So our example here, it shows the cost for 2 video cameras at $1,500 each, and the narrative provides the justification that describes the purpose and the need for the cameras. So we're able to, I just want to remind everybody, things that we're thinking of as we're going through the budget as financial analysts. We're thinking, is the cost reasonable? Is the cost necessary? And is the cost allowable? Okay. So those are different things. And the only way we know most of this is if there's a breakdown of the cost and if there's a narrative to support what it's for, what it's needed for, and how it relates to the project. All right, so to recap for this category, make sure you focus on your calculations, include a narrative for each line item, only include costs that meet your capitalization threshold. Ask your finance staff, look into your policies and procedures. And if you don't have a capitalization threshold, then you revert to the federal one, which is $5,000. So if the cost is below $5,000, then it's likely a supply item, which is our next category. Okay, so now unlike the equipment items, supplies category, this is for materials that are expendable and consumable. And it may include items like general office supplies, copy paper, training materials, postage, brochures, program supplies, and plenty of others. But all costs should be broken down and supported with the narrative. I feel like I'm going to sound like a broken record at the end of this, so my apologies in advance, but it is so important. Every single line item needs cost breakdown and a narrative. All right. Now, when you're putting your budget together, you'll include estimates for these costs, and that's understandable. You know, we don't expect you to know the exact costs that you're going to have for every single line item. There's always room for movement throughout the life of your grant. But when we talk about shared costs, and so let's take a look at this first one, which is the office supplies. So when we talk about shared costs like general supplies, you also want to include in the narrative and the computation breakdown what allocation method that you're using that equitably distributes that cost, okay? Michael, if you could include a link in the chat box to our cost allocation information sheet. So basically, like that concept of allocating a shared cost. So a brief description of like what that looks like, and or to understand what a shared cost is. So it's really anything that's used by the office as a whole that isn't directly for this one program. If we see on this list here, we have 75 client assistance kits. 75, I'm sorry. That is a direct project activity, and that is going to be charged at 100% to this grant. But now let's think about other kinds of shared supplies like toner in the copier and copy paper and pens and pencils and staples and everything. Those are things that you just have access to from the copy room, or from like the filing cabinet or whatever, and you use them as you need them, and it's not specific for one project, right? Those are shared items, and you have to make sure that every funding source that supports that office, that they're all receiving their fair share of that cost. And that's why we use what's an allocation and a method to distribute that cost. So take a look. I know that that's like 201 level conversations, and I don't want to get too far into that right now. Take a look at the cost allocation information sheet that Michael's posting. If you have any questions about that after this, it might end up being another webinar topic, but more quickly, just email us at our help desk and we'll be able to provide you with some guidance if you have questions about that. Okay. And it's also something that we look at during the budget review process, and we'll ask you more questions about too, if we have them when we're looking through it. Okay. So last here, I just want to include a reminder that any computing devices, that they can be considered a supply item instead of equipment, but it's as long as the cost is below your capitalization threshold. And if you don't have one, remember that's $5,000. So regardless of the useful life of that laptop, if the cost of the laptop or computer is below your organization's capitalization threshold, then you can put it in the supplies category. It does not have to be an equipment item. Okay. All right. Okay, so just to highlight again, the most common errors that we find in this category, make sure that you break down all costs, support each line item with a narrative, and most importantly, if you have shared costs, make sure your budget describes the allocation method that distributes the cost and that you show your computation that you use to get that percentage. So check out that link for the cost allocation information sheet, and it has a lot of really great information. Okay. Okay. We are going to move on to the subawards and procurements categories. But before we go into detail like we have been for each of these other cost categories, we're going to shift for just a little bit, maybe a little bit longer than a little bit. But we're going to talk about what each of these categories actually mean and why it's important to understand the difference between them. So this part of the training is a bit more complex, but when you don't follow this properly, it can leave your organization open to audit findings. And that's really something we want to help you avoid. Okay. So basically, anytime you pay an outside vendor, you'll need to issue them either a subaward or a contract as the agreement tool that binds them, right? So there's lots of examples like this. So for instance, you need to update your website and hire a web designer. Or let's say that you're working with another organization in your community that provides advocacy services for your survivors as part of your project. So before you engage in these services, you'll need to issue them either a subaward or a contract. Now, what do each of those mean and why is this important? So subawards, they are issued to subrecipients when they're helping to carry out part of your program activities. On the other hand, contracts are issued to contractors when you are procuring goods or services as part of operating your organization or the project. What's important to remember is that the substance of your relationship with that other entity, it's what helps drive this determination process and not what you call the actual agreement tool. So on paper, you might call a subaward a contract because, I mean, technically, yeah, it's a legally binding document like a contract. But what I'm saying is that, like, whatever you call that document, it shouldn't be what's driving your determination of whether they're a subrecipient or a contractor. Okay. We're placing a greater emphasis on this topic because we see far too often that subawards are being treated like contracts and their costs are being broken down to the budget like contracts and not subawards. And there are very specific requirements that a recipient needs to follow that align with issuing a subaward. Okay. So step one is figuring out, is this entity for the work they're doing, is this a subaward or is this a contract? Okay, so let's start this conversation by going over the characteristics of what makes an entity a subrecipient. Now, it's important to remember when we look over these characteristics that not all of them may apply in every instance. So you'll have to use your best judgment in determining which of these characteristics most closely aligns with the work being done by that entity. So a subrecipient, they will use these federal dollars that you give them. They'll use it to help carry out a program for public purpose. They're helping you carry out a part of your project. They're helping you meet your award objectives. They also must adhere to federal program requirements. They might also help determine who is eligible to receive what federal assistance. And they may have responsibility for programmatic decision making. So as you can see here, with the subrecipient, you have a strong collaborative relationship with them, right? All right, we're going to talk next about a contractor and what makes that sound a little bit different. So on the other hand, now contractors, these are when entities work in a competitive environment. They normally provide goods and services within their normal business operations, which are part of you operating your organization or running the project. And the purpose of contractors is to obtain goods and services from them. And they're not required to comply with any program requirements for the award. So you see there's less of that like collaboration. It's less of them helping you carry out your project goals and objectives and being, you know, like this collaborative partner in this whole process. It's very different from a subrecipient. So we put together a little chart here that compares the different characteristics of subrecipients and contractors. So first we're going to start off with subrecipients, and generally, I will say generally, your MOU partners are considered subrecipients. And this is because you have identified an organization in your community to help you carry out the goals and objectives of your award. And you're working collaboratively with them to meet those goals. Next is that the federal program requirements, those terms and conditions, they apply to subrecipients. So those need to be passed down from you to them because in many cases, they help your organization serve your clients and they need to follow the same requirements as your office does that we place on you, right? Additionally, any subaward funds that they receive, they need to count that towards meeting their single audit threshold so that they're also properly complying with federal audit requirements. And also your organization, you have requirements for issuing subawards. So if you issue a subaward that is more than $30,000, then you'll need to report on that subaward under the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, or as you see here, FFATA, because we acronym everything, and so we call that FFATA. All right, so there are requirements on you, so it's important that you know ahead of time, you know, when you start working with them, whether or not you are going to issue a subaward or a contract. Last and most importantly, when you are paying a subrecipient, you are reimbursing them for their actual costs that they're incurring, and there's no profit being made there. It's the same as a relationship that we have with your office, right? So we're just going to reimburse you for your expenses, and you're not including any profit margin in these budgets, right? It's the same with your subrecipient. You've identified somebody in the community. They're going to help you carry out this activity, this project for the public good. They're not looking to make a profit there. You're just reimbursing them for their actual expenses. So they're going to invoice you for their actual costs that they're incurring, like their staff time, fringe, travel, etc. And it's not like a loaded rate that includes any profit in it. So that's like, I would say probably one of the biggest differences with the subrecipients versus contractors. So shifting to contractors, one of the biggest differences there is that with contracts, you have to follow your procurement procedures. How do you know that a rate that a contractor quotes for you is reasonable? And I ask that because that rate that they quote you, that can include a profit margin because that's how they conduct business. That's their business model, is that they make profit off of this. And they're allowed to do that, right? You're not going to tell the web designer like, well, what's your actual costs that you're incurring? Because that's what we're going to pay. that just doesn't happen. Like you're going to pay the rate that they say, but how do you know that it's a fair rate? It's because you go through a competitive process for identifying who you work with. Okay. That is a contractor. And that is very different from a subrecipient. A subrecipient, you don't go through any of that process, right? You are just paying them for their actual costs. There's no profit being earned there. All right. So part of the procurement procedures that you're following is that this is free and open competition. Okay. And that's how you know that a cost is reasonable and that it is a fair market value that you're receiving for that. Okay, so contract provisions as well from the uniform guidance under Appendix 2, they also apply to contracts. Take a look at that as uniform guidance. And last, with contracts, like I said, they can earn a profit for the work they do. Like they will charge a fee for service, and that's what it is. That's their business model, right? And the way that, like I said, the way that you know that a price is good is by doing a comparison of other people who are out there in the market who are doing the same work, getting some quotes, getting some bids, etc. So the rate that they charge, it's fine. In this case, for it to include profit margin, that's just a business practice. So that's the last thing on this list here. All right, so that's just like a kind of a brief overview of the differences between the two of them. Now, I know that was a lot of information. A lot of it seems like there are some gray areas where you might see a letter from column A, a letter from column B. So what we recommend for you or for our recipients, if you're awarded, is that our recipients develop a policy and a checklist type of form that documents the process that took place to support the decision that was made. So like whether or not you issued a subaward or a contract. And that decision-making process should be based off of those characteristics, which is available in the uniform guidance. So they list everything out in there. We didn't just make up this list. It does come from uniform guidance. The citation at the bottom, we're at the bottom of the slides. So again, why is all of this so important? And the biggest reason is that contracts and subawards, they have very different requirements that are tied to each. A contract must follow your procurement procedures and ensure which ensures that that whatever cost you're paying, it was a proper negotiation because it was a competitive process and you looked at what was available in the market and you were able to determine that this is a reasonable rate. Okay. On the other hand, we have subawards and they must follow the uniform guidance requirements for pass-through entities. We're going to talk a bit about each of these over the next few slides, actually. All right, so we're going to talk first about subawards and what is expected from the entity. So from if you receive an award, you'd be the recipient. So what's expected from the recipient or organization when issuing subawards? You're going to see this term called pass-through entity, and the uniform guidance, it's just a fancy way of saying if you issue a subaward. Okay, so when you issue a subaward, you become a pass-through entity. All right, so you'll need to clearly identify in the agreement document that it is a subaward, like say this is a subaward, and there is a whole list of items in the uniform guidance that you need to include in that. I have the citation on the slide right here. So just make sure that you include everything from the uniform guidance in this place in the guidance when you issue a subaward, and that you are including all the items. All right. You also need to assess that the subrecipients potential for any risk for non-compliance, since they'll be carrying out part of the award, and it might be a significant amount. You can look at their prior history with subawards, their audits, whether there's been a lot of turnover with leadership at that organization, and any other monitoring findings they've had from other federal agencies. Also make sure that you're checking sam.gov, because we can't give federal funds to an entity that has been excluded or debarred. All right, so make sure you're checking sam.gov, also documenting that you have checked it, because if you're ever audited, the auditor will look and want to see, okay, did they check sam.gov? So just make sure that you're documenting that as well. If based on your risk assessment, if you identify that you need to add any other special conditions to the subaward that you're issuing, you can also do that on the subaward document. Just make sure that they're also current on audit requirements, and you can make adjustments on your records, like how you plan to monitor them based on what you see in the audits. So ensure that you're monitoring their activities and reports, and when necessary, you can take enforcement action if they don't comply. And I know this is a lot of information about like if you are awarded, when that happens, what you'll need to do, things that you'll need to follow. So like this part of it, you can just like put in the back of your brain and just say, okay, if I'm awarded and if I issue a subaward, I need to come back to this and make sure that I'm doing all these things. Okay, but we little bit on managing and monitoring subawards. So the last bit on this is that you'll need to ensure that you're monitoring their activities and how they spend funds, and that they're complying with all the requirements. If you find anything, make sure you address it. And then with subrecipient monitoring, you can also use this as an opportunity to provide training, technical assistance, on-site monitoring if you think it's needed, and arrange agreed upon procedures engagement. So lots of different options depending on what you find is needed based on the risk assessment that you performed in the beginning. Okay. Again, these are things that are going to be a little bit more relevant if you do end up getting awarded and if you do end up issuing the subaward. But we're going to move, but they are also important to understand too, because you might start the process right away. So we want to make sure that you are not waiting until a new grantee orientation that might be a few months into your award to know that these things should be in place when you receive your award and you want to get started on making these arrangements and issuing these subawards and contracts to your partner, to people in the community. Okay, so let's shift gears. We're going to talk about contracts and how you're following your procurement procedures because you're procuring goods and services from an outside vendor. So first and foremost is that you want to make sure that you have a documented procurement policy and that it complies with the UNUPRM guidance. And as you can see in the second bullet here, make sure that you're checking SAM.gov. Again, federal funds cannot go to pay for any organization that has been excluded or debarred, and it'll list it on there. Ensure that you're following your policy for conflicts of interest and that you're applying your procurement policy consistently across the board, which should allow for free and open competition. All right, if you have, this part is relevant for your creating your budget. If you have any big ticket purchases in your budget for like a vehicle or a copy machine, you want to make sure that you're also including a lease versus purchase analysis where you show the cost comparison of both leasing and purchasing the item and demonstrate that the choice that you selected is the most cost-effective option. Also ensure that you're keeping records of all your procurement documents and ensure that each contract outlines all payment terms. And last, if you're requesting to enter into a contract for more than $250,000 that's not being competitively bid, then make sure that you come in for prior approval for that. And I guess this is the last one, but make sure that you're also avoiding obtaining any unnecessary or duplicative items. All right, last comment about contracts and how to manage them is that for your consultants, okay, because you might be working with consultants a lot and you might have those in your budget. So this is actually really, really key to understanding. So if you zoned out during the last like 5 slides, I get it. My feelings aren't hurt, but let's zone back in right now. Okay, so these are for costs for contractors that provide consulting services, trainers, speakers, etc. And the biggest, most important piece to highlight is that there is a threshold for their costs that when you exceed that amount, it requires prior approval. So if the consultant rate is more than $81.25 an hour or $650 per day for an 8-hour day, then you'll need to obtain prior approval. Okay. It is not a standard DOJ rate. And that's like the big bold letters at the bottom of this slide, right? $650 per day is the threshold, not a standard OVW or DOJ rate. There is no standard rate. There's no standard rate for anything because all consultant rates should be reasonable. Excuse me, I'm too fast. should be reasonable. They should be based on that individual consultant's experience, their education, the current market conditions for where you're at. This is why it's so important to understand that the threshold of $81.25 an hour is not a general baseline level of pay that should be applied to all consultants. Rather, it is just a threshold that once you go over it, you need to come in for prior approval with the OPW. Okay, DOJ does not have a standard consultant rate. All right, I feel like I hit that point enough. Let's move on. We've talked a fair amount about how to make a determination of a subrecipient, how to determine if they're a contractor, the different characteristics of each, and what you need to do when you issue them. So I feel like we talked about that a lot. So we're going to shift gears back to the budget. And now we're going to apply all of that we just talked about. We're going to apply that into actually working on the budget. So just like you are budgeting your costs throughout the budget, your subrecipients will do the same thing in the subawards category. So as you see here, the sample, because remember, you are reimbursing them for their costs, just like we're reimbursing you for your costs, okay? So whatever they think that they're going to incur as a result of them helping or taking part of this project, they're going to list them out. They're going to list everything out, break everything out, support everything with the narrative, just like you did for your expenses. It's just going to be like this little subcategory of subawards. So in the sample budget, we see that each subrecipient that they outline their staff with their salaries, estimated time in the subaward, fringe benefits, travel costs. And as you can see here, we have the OBW sponsored TA technical assistance and training event. So because they laid it out so beautifully, I can very easily identify that, hey, that's great. $4,000 are being allocated for this specific purpose. And I can add that to the other one in the travel category. And I know now that they have met their threshold, the requirements, excuse me. Okay, so basically just to recap, same type of breakdown and narrative that you would have throughout the budget for your costs. You're applying those same principles to your subrecipients. Just make it clear to follow, clear to go through, you know, like have one subrecipients, all their costs, then the next subrecipient, if you have another one, all of their expenses and their narratives, just kind of make it easy to follow for the next person. So just reduce the amount of questions that come through later on. Okay, so moving on to contracts and what you would have in the procurements category, we'll put all of your contractor, consultant costs, leases, anything like that. That's all going to go in the procurement category. So you'll need to break down all line items to show the hourly rate times the total hours for each contractor and consultant. And this is, again, bringing it back to like the whole why. Like, why is this all important? Why do you need to show us all this information? It's because, one, we have to make sure that the cost is reasonable. So if there's no breakdown and it just says like $30,000 for something, I have no idea if that's a reasonable amount, right? So by showing me how you got to that 30,000, how you got to that number, then I can determine, okay, that does seem reasonable to provide X amount of hours of work at X amount of dollar rate for that person. Okay, so one, reasonable. And two, if there are any thresholds for prior approval that are required for that type of line item, we can identify that easily and we would know whether or not you would have to come in for prior approval for a cost. So like if a consultant's rate exceeds $81.25 an hour, if you have your breakdown there, I can easily identify that that would need prior approval. Okay. One last thing to note is that the copier and printer leases, that they're in this category rather than the equipment category. We talked about that earlier because a copier here is being leased and not outright purchased. So you'll also notice that the cost is being allocated by 53%. And that's because, like we talked about, cost allocation. It is an office-wide copier. It is not only used by this program in this case. Okay. So since all staff are sharing and using the item, all of the funding sources who support that office, they need to bear their fair share of this cost. And so an allocation rate was applied that is applied across all of the shared costs. Okay, moving on to the other cost category. A lot of what goes in this category are costs that don't fall under the more specific ones that we already went through. So some examples of costs that go here include rent for your office space for staff, registration fees for training events, client and survivor assistance costs like transportation and other types of participant support costs. I mean, we have like a massive library of programs, right? And they all cover different types of things. So you're going to see all different types of costs. So it's impossible to have an all-exhausting list of everything that's included. But I mean, you get the general gist. The costs in this category, you can remember that they're estimates. So if you don't know the exact monthly cost, that's okay. It can go up and down each month. That's fine. You just want to maybe try to use historical data to estimate like how you can to estimate each of these figures. If there are any costs that are shared, like we discussed before already, like with the general office supplies, you want to make sure that you're allocating them using your cost allocation method. And that should be demonstrated for me in both the calculation, in the computation, and also in the narrative, okay? So take the guesswork out of it and just be explicit in the narrative and the computation about how you determined these numbers. So all costs, again, must be broken down to show the calculation of how you determine the total cost and supported by a narrative that describes and justifies the need for it. So remember, when we're reviewing budgets, we have to assess the reasonableness of the cost. And we can only do that if there is a breakdown of how the cost was determined to begin with. So your program manager, they're also going to look at if a cost is necessary. And how do they do that? They have to see that there's a narrative there that ties it to like the why. Why is this needed for this project? Again, so the narrative, you got a breakdown and you got a narrative. Every single line item needs both of those. All right. So one question that we get sometimes from applicants who own their own office or facility is whether or not they can charge that cost, right? So like it's not technically rent because you own the place. You know, it's not rented from like an outside source, but you still are incurring a cost. So what can you do? The answer, can you charge that? The answer is yes, you can charge a proportionate or allocated amount of the cost of ownership. So that can include things like insurance, maintenance, depreciation, other similar types of costs. But what you cannot charge is mortgage or interest, all right? So when you break down all of these costs in the budget and in the narrative, just like you would any other cost, just make sure that you're clear about what it's covering so that we, don't have to come back and say, okay, does this include anything that is unallowable like mortgage or interest? So in our budget example here, we have the cost for bus vouchers for survivors when attending therapy sessions or receiving other direct services, and they're estimated at $15 per voucher. The important thing to take away from this line item example is that in your narrative, you should describe for any voucher or gift card the internal controls that you have in place to ensure the proper maintenance, inventory, and distribution of those items, all right? So like gift cards or vouchers, whatever that you have on file. Are they kept in a locked box? How often are they inventoried and by whom? When they're distributed, are they required to be signed out by a specific staff person or two? And what is the oversight process of that? Are these processes all documented in your internal policies and procedures? All of this should be described in the narrative because that's what we're looking for during our budget review process, because we need to make sure that you have that in place before we can allow that you have you have those gift cards and vouchers on hand at your office. So you have to have something to safeguard the items, and those internal controls are important. So be proactive, include it in the budget. It'll definitely be helpful to move the process along quickly. So to highlight the most important things to remember with the other category is break down all costs, include a narrative for all line items that describes and justifies the cost. All shared costs are allocated and the allocation method is described in the narrative. And any vouchers or gift cards, if they're allowed by that program, because again, it has to be allowable. Does the program allow them? That you want to include a description in the narrative of your documented internal controls that you have in place that helps to safeguard them, okay? Okay, so we talked about all of the direct costs and how to classify them throughout the budget in the direct cost categories. We are going to shift and move over to the indirect costs now. Okay, as we touched on earlier, indirect costs are those costs that cannot be readily identifiable to a specific cost objective, and they tend to benefit more than one activity or like the operations of your entire organization as a whole. So think about costs that you have for operating and maintaining your facilities, or general administrative costs, human resource costs, where the activities benefit the entire organization and not just one specific grant project. For example, let's say that you have finance staff and they process all of the payroll, they do all the invoices that come in, they pay all the bills, they do all the financial statements for your organization, and everything else financial related for your organization, right? Because all of their activities benefit the entire organization, and you can't say for sure that the time spent on one, you can't identify, pull out the time spent on one single grant project. Okay, if that's the case, you can't identify it to a specific project, then their time, their fringe benefits, and any other overhead costs that touch them, those are all considered indirect costs and cannot be charged directly in one of the direct cost categories. Okay, it has to be recovered, or it can only be recovered indirectly. Now, there's only two ways that you can include indirect costs in this category. The first is by having a current federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, and that's one that you negotiate with your federal agency, and then you end up with the rate and all this, this whole like big agreement thing at the very end. But take note of the word current that I used, because far too often we are reviewing budgets that use agreements that are expired. So make sure that your rate is current and up to date and that it's submitted. But the range of time that the rate agreement covers, it's listed on the document itself. So if you've never seen one before, then don't worry about it. If you don't have an indirect cost rate agreement, then you can just pull this bit of information out of your brain and not have to worry about it. But if you do have an indirect cost rate agreement with your organization, then you do need to make sure that you are applying it correctly. You're looking at it, that it's covered, that the range of time that it covers, or at least the very beginning of your award, and subsequent years, just make sure that you're renegotiating it. I also see a lot of times, like let's say you submit 4 applications for 4 different programs that you're eligible for, right, for OVW awards in a year. The indirect cost rate agreement might only be attached to one of the applications and not the other 3. So make sure you include it. It's relevant to every single application that is including indirect costs in that budget document. All right, just saves us all time, saves everybody time. Now, the second way that you can recover indirect costs is by using the de minimis rate, and that's where you calculate 10% of modified total direct costs. There's an entire section in the uniform guidance that we have referenced at the bottom of the slide, to CFR Part 200.414, and it goes over when you can use the de minimis rate, how to apply it. There's also an entire definition on what modified total direct costs include. So just make sure you take a look at it if you plan on using it. All right. And again, as always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to call the GFMD help desk or send us an email. Okay. So we have 2 examples here for recovering indirect costs in the budget. The first is for applicants who have that approved rate agreement that we talked about. So in this example, the rate is 32%, and the base on the rate agreement, it says it's direct salaries, not including fringe benefits. So from our sample budget worksheet, the total for just salaries from personnel came to $321,000. So in our sample budget, the applicant here, they multiply the total salary against the rate of 32%, and they're able to determine that $102,720 is for indirect costs. All right. I don't want you to get lost in the numbers, but it's just, there's plenty of ways that indirect costs can be computed, like whether or not it's on the salaries or whether or not it's on salaries plus fringe benefits or modified total direct costs. The point is that there is a base and there's a rate, and you charge the two of them together to get your indirect costs. All right. The other example here is for the de minimis rate. So if you elect to use a de minimis rate, then you have to indicate that clearly in the budget. Like, I can't tell you how often I see where an application in this category just has 10% indirect costs, and it doesn't even indicate that the de minimis rate is being used. Like, it is the name of that rate, right? So please specify, we are electing to use the de minimis rate of 10% on modified total direct costs. So you have to tell me that you're using that. Otherwise, I am not allowed to make an assumption that you're using it. So please be very clear that you are using the de minimis rate. Also, what's really helpful and will reduce a lot of guesswork and additional questions on our part, if in the narrative you just include like how you came up with that modified total direct cost base. So on the sample that you see on here, that would be the $467,009. Okay. So just like that's how you would want to include like how did I come up with this number? Here it is, and just like list them out. Okay. Again, the definition for modified total direct costs can be found in the uniform guidance. Okay, so real quick, I just really want to thank everybody for sticking with us for this. I know it's been like a solid hour of conversations about budgets and numbers and reasonable costs and everything. I know it's a lot of information to wrap your head around. This is being recorded and will be posted to our website. So I hope you take the time to rewatch this later, let some of it sink in, watch it again. We really just want you to be as successful as possible when creating your budget. But, to wrap things up, to recap everything, I just want to go through the biggest highlights. So just remember, when you're creating your budget, when you're going through it, make sure all your costs, that they have a breakdown and that it shows the calculation for how you determine the total. All shared costs should be allocated with an allocation method and the computation that's described in the narrative. Speaking of narrative, every cost in the budget should have a corresponding narrative description of the cost and justification of why it's necessary. Please only use the federal cost categories that we just went through, and don't make any up, right? Don't make up any new ones. It really helps the process go by quicker if you just stick to the cost categories that we listed out here. But if you have any questions about a cost category, if you're not sure where one goes, just ask our help desk. We're happy to help you out with that, or ask, today. We're going to keep on, we're going to stay on the line after this for a little bit and answer some questions. The total project time that you budget for, it should be equal to the total time listed in your solicitation. So if the program solicitation says that the project is for 36 months, then make sure that you are submitting a budget that covers a full 36 months worth of activity. And last, and I cannot emphasize this enough, please triple check your calculations. With all the things that you have to consider when putting your budget together, calculating numbers is by far one of the easiest parts of this process, right? But I can't tell you how often we receive budgets with simple calculation errors and that we can't approve it, right? Like I can't move a budget forward that has calculation errors in it. So it's one of the quickest things that you can do. The easiest things that you can do is maybe just have somebody else triple check all those calculations for you, if that'll be helpful. But it really helps things move along quickly on our end if calculations are accurate. So it just makes for a nice, clean budget. All right. So I really hope that this training was that it was able to provide some insight on how to create your OVW budget, give you some guidance on the things that we see most often that we have questions about with our applicants and their budgets. I do want to wish everybody good luck on your application and keep doing great work. We are going to stay on the call for a bit longer just to go over any other questions you may have, but we're going to go ahead and just stop the recording at this point. So don't